Welcome to the launch of the Global Panel's new brief on strengthening food systems in fragile contexts. This is Sandy Thomas, Director of the Global Panel, and I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this event with the World Food Programme. Although we're unable to be physically present, we're really delighted to be together with this audience online, and we have a really excellent panel of speakers to join us. Now, the launch is live, the link is in the chat room, and it's also live on the Global Panel's website. Now, I'm just going to give a few housekeeping bits of information before I turn to our speakers. So just to say, you'll see that there is a question and answer session later, and I would encourage you to submit your questions during the event and not leave it till the Q&A session. And when you submit a question, please identify yourself and also give your affiliation. And just to clarify that the Teams live event system doesn't allow attendees to actually take the floor, and the organisers will select some of the questions for our discussion period, and those questions will be visible on the chat box, so do send those questions in. Of course, we won't be able to answer all the questions, but we're going to be very happy to answer some of them in a written form after the event and during the week. And then just to remind our panelists that to remain on mute until you're actually speaking, just to keep down background noise. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our distinguished panel has to say, and I'm going to start off by asking the co-chair of the Global Panel, Sir John Beddington, to provide some opening remarks. Sir John, you have the floor. I think you're still on mute, John.
Can you hear me now? You're muted, don't worry, I'm assuming I can be heard. Yeah. Okay, well look, good afternoon everybody, and thank you all for taking part in this. I'm absolutely delighted that we have this chance to launch the latest of the Global Panel's work on strengthening food systems in fragile context. And I'm particularly delighted that we're actually co-chairing this launch with the World Food Programme, whose work has been stunning in its effect and comprehensiveness. And I think I just, as a little remark, say that I have been absolutely delighted by the way that the World Food Programme has been orientating its work to longer term issues rather than just the full humanitarian response that they're so excellent at. Perhaps I should just start my remarks by saying a little bit about the Global Panel. This was founded in August 2013 in the Nutrition for Growth Summit, and I and His Excellency John Kafur have been co-chairs since that time. We have a superb panel which has changed from time to time, but it has been operating under Sandy Thomas's leadership for the last 4 or 5 years. And we work across agriculture and nutrition, and we try to produce both briefs like this one, but also more comprehensive documents, which I'll refer to a little later. Now, it's obviously a massive problem at the moment, which has been exaggerated by the COVID-19 outbreak. And a number of speakers I know are going to refer to this, so I won't try to repeat what they've actually said. But I think the issues that the Global Panel have focused on is that understandably at the moment, as we're dealing with fragile states, undernutrition is the biggest problem, or malnutrition. But in addition, the panel is very concerned about what you might call the obesity epidemic. The figures on that are startling. 1 in 3 people are either overweight or globally obese, and that's in the whole world. So there's well in excess of 2.5 billion people are in that situation. And there is obviously a massive issue, both in terms of hunger, which is being addressed, but that has been exacerbated and made worse by the COVID-19 outbreak. So whether in fact it is a problem of malnutrition, of micronutrient deficiency, obesity, or diet-related non-communicable diseases, the key issue is that they all are generated by poor diets. And I know a number of our speakers will focus on that. But it's not just health. I think that the other concern that we have, in addition to COVID-19, is the looming climate change crisis. And one of the really concerning issues that we have is that a very large proportion of greenhouse gases come from emissions from our food system, and the IPCC and many other commentators have pointed that out. I think that the problem here is a mix of really difficult problems, and also the fact that they interact so closely within the diet. And quite clearly, it's the emergency distribution of foods are going to be the problem for the immediate future. But we have an opportunity to actually address issues about the general question of food systems, and it's a win-win. And albeit the COVID epidemic is a ghastly problem for humanity, it does give an opportunity to reassess food systems more generally. And towards the end of this month and early next month, the Global Panel will be publishing a new foresight report, which actually addresses the problem for all stakeholders, but it also takes the point that don't just preach to our stakeholders, recognize that there are practical things that they can do. And the Foresight project has been running for 2 years. It will be publishing. It's a substantial report, but it is a substantial report which tries to focus on the issues and on what individual stakeholders, whether they're donors, whether they're LMIC governments, whether they're business, or whether there are leaders from other aspects, for example, in the commercial sector, saying what they could do now. So with that, I now like to pass back to Sandy, and thank you all very much for attending. I very much look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, John, for providing that background. I'm now going to move to our second speaker, who is Ute Klamert, Assistant Executive Director for Partnerships and Advocacy for WFP. And she oversees the organization's resource mobilization activities and the partnerships for many different related organizations across the piece. Now, we're really delighted to have Ms. Klamert with us, and again, just to echo what Sir John said about the co-hosting with WFP. So I'd like to ask Ms. Klamert, as the Assistant Executive Director of what is the largest humanitarian agency in the world, can you tell us from your perspective why it's so important to strengthen food systems, not only in more stable contexts, but also in humanitarian fragile contexts? And perhaps you could go on to say something about the journey that WFP has had in this domain. Thank you. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. Can you hear me? I hope technically everything is okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So I'm also very delighted to be here today, Sandy, and to co-host and listening also to the opening remarks of Sir John. That was great. And the reason is very simple. I mean, this is the launch of a very important document, Strengthening Food Systems in Fragile Contexts. I must say this is our topic. If you allow me, I'm dividing my introductory remark into two elements or two components. The one is the description of the situation of our perspective in our work, and then the second part definitely sharing with you concrete elements of our work and definitely elaborating a little bit on our journey from the saving lives to the changing life agenda. Let me start and put it in that way. I mean, for a World Food Program, food system matters profoundly. And if we are to achieve a world without hunger and malnutrition by 2030 SDG 2, it's very imperative to improve access to healthy diets. And I'm very grateful that John was mentioning the issue of obesity, because I think obesity is the issue we definitely have to monitor far more closely than we have done all the years before. Our holistic mandate, WFP's holistic mandate in terms of humanitarian and the development mandate domain, even so we are have the largest humanitarian arm, we try to explore elements in how are we unfolding our changing life agenda, and in a way position our experience in the food systems arena. We are working especially, as you all know, in fragile contexts where 2/3 of our work is, Sandy, and where people are 3 times more likely to be undernourished. And this is personally always, I must say, a figure which strikes me absolutely in particular. 3 times more likely to be undernourished if you are living in a fragile context. From our experience and comparative advantage, if I may say so, from a WFP perspective, derives a profound understanding of food systems at the supply, but also on the demand side, as well as in terms of necessary conditions for them to function optimally and to be efficiently absolutely rebuilt. We are operating in circumstances where food systems are simply broken. I want to flag, even prior to COVID-19 pandemic, almost 700 million people were chronically hungry, and 3 billion people could not afford a healthy diet. This suggests that many food systems are already failing, as I said, and independently of the cause, such failures impact more harshly the most vulnerable and marginalized. And that brings me back to the striking figure of the 2/3 of our operations in fragile contexts. The current pandemic has brought the fragility of food systems sharply into focus, and I'm sure that Mark Lowcock will agree to that kind of statement, especially in fragile states where food systems were already flawed and disrupted, and now it's showcasing in a COVID-19 framework that food systems really need a really high attention. Why? It affects all aspects of the food systems, the production side, the distribution side, the consumption side, and all actors and livelihoods along the whole food value chain, from farmers, processors, distributors to the millions of consumers. So we are talking about the whole food value chain. The impacts on food systems and markets are felt at global and local levels, resulting in job losses, reduced incomes, increased food insecurity, and as already mentioned, in malnutrition. And it is estimated from our side that the pandemic could push a further 83 to 132 million individuals into hunger in 2020, an additional 14% children into acute malnutrition. What does that mean for our decade of action and the 10 years to go to achieve SDG 2? This definitely reminds us of the priority of making food systems functional, sustainable, resilient to shocks, as to improve access to healthy and diet foods globally. In fragile contexts in particular, Sandy, this means averting famines and food crises while preventing the emergence of new cases of malnutrition. And I'm just underlining and really stressing, and we must act now. Duality of actions, that's the suggestion, from response to prevention and assisting vulnerable groups to access healthy diets, are at the core of our mandate and work. And that is part of my response to your question in terms of our journey So we have to, in a way, definitely engage in the humanitarian emergency domain, but we have to make sure that what is called the, in donor speech, the nexus, that we find concepts to unfold and unpack nexus elements, and that we bring anticipatory measures together with humanitarian aspects, and that is definitely where I'm proud to say WFP is very well positioned. But exactly the strengthening food system in fragile contexts, exactly this policy paper will enable us, really to think about these kind of new concepts and really, is hopefully bringing us to the next level. Part 2, my small brief part 2, Sandy, illustration from our work. We created already in 2016 a food system strategy far before I joined WFP, policies and support services, and launched a 5-year systematic food initiative. Hopefully all the family listening knows that under SIS Food. So that's a quite, let me say, old kind of launch, but it's definitely unfolding its impact and its results. 3 elements of our work to conclude. Number 1, providing technical assistance in support of food systems transformation towards better nutrition on a globally, as well as on a global level, as well as on a country level. Actively contributing to global policy dialogue. This is part of our global policy dialogue, generation, dissemination of evidences. I'm a strong fan of impact generation and impact evidence kind of work, so that we know what's working and what is not working. And then finally, efficiently advocating to end malnutrition, as Sir John was saying. I mean, that's definitely, one of the reasons why all these policy documents are so relevant for us. We are part, as you know, as the Rome-based agency family, together with IFAD and in particular with FAO. We try to be really the key technical partner in that set to the Committee on the World Food Security, and we have actively supported, as you all know, the development of the guidelines of food systems and nutrition, just to set a global standard for the world food security, advocating for those to give due attention, in particular in humanitarian settings. And we are part of several platforms. The Sun Movement is one, and its particular related networks, and we play a key role. As you know, the Food System Summit is ahead of us in 2021, Sandy, and we had been asked to be the lead agency for action track number 5. I must say I'm super happy with that choice, because track 5 is dealing with building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks and stresses, and this is exactly where this kind of policy document will play a crucial role for us, just to be the lead of action track 5. And of course, we've developed a lot of analytical tools, programming models, M&E tools. For example, Fill the Nutrition Gap tool, nutrition sensitive programming tool. All the experts listening to us hopefully are very well aware. At country level, we play a key role in supporting the governments in building multi-sectoral action, enhancing coordination mechanisms, and embedding nutrition across all the kind of elements of the food systems. And again, it's supply chain, environment, and consumer behavior, which is definitely, according to me, a very crucial one. And I'm happy my colleague Michael Dumford from the East African region is joining us at the panel, and definitely will come in with very concrete elements. To conclude, Chair, with our deep field experience, I must say, in both in food security in the development domain, as well as in the emergency response, and our strategic partnerships across private and public stakeholders, I think I'm proud to say we think we have an enormous potential and great capacity to leverage diverse platforms in order really to build resilience to food systems in fragile settings. My favorite word, Sandy, is building resilience and make society's resilience. And in particular, in a complex humanitarian crisis, you know, we have to deal with it in a very, very holistic manner. And as I said, from production, distribution, right till the end of the consumption. Thank you for listening to me, but I must say, you know, I'm quite proud about our work, and I hope that some of the key elements of the work I illustrated and I have chosen will contribute to our discussion. And I'm very happy to get some questions, in particular also in our journey in the Saving Life and Changing Life agenda. Thank you, Sandy, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Ute. That's tremendously encouraging to hear your enthusiasm for all the work that you're doing in food systems. So given the challenges, this really couldn't be more important. So I'm now going to move to our next speaker. And our third speaker is Patrick Webb, Professor Patrick Webb, who's a professor of nutrition at Tufts University and also the Global Panel's technical advisor. And Patrick is going to tell us about the brief. Patrick, are you with us? I know.
Yes,
Patrick...
I am, and I hope you can hear me.
Oh, that's great, Patrick. I know that there were a few technical issues on your side, so I'm very pleased to hear you. There was a slight delay there. So, Patrick, you very kindly agreed to give us an overview of the findings of the brief, which you had a big role in. And it would be great if you could tell us about the really key recommendations coming from the evidence that you've looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy, and also Ute and Sir John. Great honor to be here in this context. Let me just start by saying my journey in this particular space, just like Sir Mark, who's going to be offering comments a little bit later, both started in the context of the Ethiopia famine in the 1980s, and he was very much involved in the F word, the famine response, and I lived there for 3 years trying to wrap my head around what on earth happened there and what could be done differently. It marks you. And I think it's important to note, as Ute did, that humanitarian action has evolved, has changed a lot, and there are huge successes to report. And the upsurge of famine, frank famine, has become increasingly rare, which is an amazing, wonderful thing that we often forget. However, the persistence of fragility and chronic instability in so much of the world remains a problem. And I think so that's what we're focusing on here. And there were three main drivers behind the inception of this particular policy brief. One is actually the often invisible or hidden scale of this problem. Many people who work in this space know it, but the numbers of people involved, the resources dedicated to humanitarian action, to trying to do something in fragile states is huge. But resolving the particular problems doesn't require just more of the same kind of assistance. It requires investments in long-term change, strengthening the food system as a whole in linked up ways. So linking humanitarian and development together. And that means addressing food systems in a holistic way that Ute just spelled out, linking not just the resources of humanitarian action and development policy, but the thinking around this joined up solutions. And then the third thing underpinning this is if we don't act differently quickly, the future is going to be even more challenging, not just with the pandemic, but the effects of climate change and so on. So first slide, please. I'm going to run through just a few of the major messages. Can we go to the next slide, please? So big numbers, almost 2 billion people living in fragile settings, and I'll describe those very briefly. And that's a number that's projected to increase. So when people talk about poverty, which is obviously a major metric, we also have to understand that by 2030, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development projects that 80% of poor people are going to be poor people living in fragile contexts just in a few years. And that speaks to a great need to understand those contexts. It's not just poverty, perhaps as we knew it in stable settings, but things are that poverty is increasingly concentrated in places where it's most difficult to effect lasting change and sustainable actions across the food system. Next slide, please. That means we need to be thinking more carefully about the context. Now, fragile in the context of this brief, we're not defining it in one way, but it's a combination of many different things that includes what you'd expect: conflict and governance and environmental resource degradation and political instability, overlain, of course, by shocks of different kinds, whether they be drought or locusts or pandemics. All of these, in various ways and combined, can directly or indirectly disrupt food systems, and food systems are at the core of people's lives and livelihoods, especially in these locations. Next, please. Those fragile states are, perhaps not surprisingly, they're largely where you might expect them to be, mainly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and across into South Asia, with some hotspots in Latin America. These are defined by the Fragile States Index, which is updated on an annual basis. Next, please. And that overlaps quite strongly with the number and percent of acutely food insecure people, right, which we know are heavily concentrated in parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, and across Middle East into South Asia. So there's a strong association between that fragility, which spikes and goes back into chronic condition and spikes again, with the acute food insecurity. Next, please. Next slide, please. In Africa, and Uta alluded to this, just sub-Saharan Africa, undernourishment, the FAO metric of chronic undernourishment, has been rising. We know that in the last few years, very worryingly, and it's been rising faster in countries that have experienced various forms of conflict. Next, please. Conflict, be it interstate or intrastate. And that top line, the purple line, is the prevalence of chronic undernourishment in Africa in countries in conflict versus the yellow line below it, countries in Africa without conflict. They were running more or less in parallel until 2015, but you can see both are rising, but they're rising faster in the conflict countries, which is a serious concern when seeking lasting solutions. Next slide, please. In response to this rising danger, rising need, rising demand for assistance, humanitarian assistance has been climbing, arguably not as fast or as high as it should, but it's already very close to 30 billion a year, most of that from public resources, but a fair amount of it from private resources as well. But that's what we're looking at, $30 billion a year being dedicated to keep people's lives and livelihoods going, not long-term investment in sustainability, resilience, and reduced fragility. Next slide, please. This will have to continue for some time. People in need, people whose lives are threatened, require appropriate humanitarian assistance. And 7 countries, just 7, account for half of all that resource at this point. And again, large regional concerns like Syria, the Syria regional crisis, but also Yemen, South Sudan, and ongoing problems in Iraq and Somalia. These are where the bulk of the money is going on an annual basis. But as you well know, that means year on year, these problems are persisting. So there is a chronic nature to these acute problems. Next slide, please. 2 points from this elaboration of 2017, the humanitarian funds. Number 1, food is the principal focus of humanitarian action still. We're still trying to get food into the hands of women and children who need them, trying to resolve and prevent mortality, which is mediated through malnutrition, so getting the right foods to the right people at the right time. That's the bar. The purple bars is how much was allocated. So food and various multi-sector activities in health, wash activities, water and sanitation, those dominate, as you might expect. The second point is the green. The actual amounts funded were in many cases 100% higher than what was actually received. So the measured need and the requests for resources are even now not being met by the same levels of donor funding. So there's a big challenge in that a lot of resources are being allocated to this, but it's not nearly enough even for the humanitarian part of the equation. Next slide, please. We're almost there. So our message is one that Uta already flagged. Too many people in the world already cannot afford a healthy diet, let alone a sustainable healthy diet. And 2/3 of those are living in fragile contexts. What we're calling for is not new policy initiatives necessarily, although there are innovations in the use of cash and vouchers, in improved technologies for storage and value along the value chain, improved refrigeration and solar power and so on. But what we're looking to communicate is two things. A lot of actions are possible, and there is evidence that they do work cost effectively across all the domains of the food system, aimed at enhancing the food environment for consumers in these fragile settings. So a linked up, coherent, coordinated actions are needed, not just in one place or another, to make the food system viable and strengthened to increase resilience of that system. That's one important point. And the other is that to do this, you have to link whatever actions happen in humanitarian context with investments in the long term outside of humanitarian actions. So the linked up nature isn't just in the domains of the food system, but there has to be more coherence, more strategic thinking about how to link up the rest of a national food system to those sub-food systems that are operating in fragile contexts, which fragile parts of those same countries. So there's 8 priority actions that this brief proposes, but really this is a summary of what we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please, and the final one, which we can't see, but essentially, there we go. I think it's important that we acknowledge we don't pit humanitarian action against development resources. Humanitarian actions have been hugely successful and remain a major success story today, but they alone will not solve many of the problems underpinning a lack of resilience and the fragility of food systems in so many of these countries, affecting so many consumers, so many people. So keeping people alive, which we do better and better every year, has to be linked up effectively to nourishing them so they can thrive and become more resilient. That's not just a person by person action. It requires system-wide coherence and a big focus on making those food systems both resilient and sustainable in the long term. I will stop there and thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you, Patrick, for laying that out so clearly. Before I go to the next speaker, Sir Mark Lowcock, I just want to say that there are over 750 people joining us now in the audience, which is really great. And I should have said at the beginning that this session is being recorded and it will be available online. So I'm now going to go to our next speaker. We're delighted to be joined by Sir Mark Lowcock, who's Under Secretary General for UN OCHA, who will speak about the need for a cross-sectoral response. So I want to ask Mark, who's been in this role since I think 2017, and welcome, Mark. So given your role and your experience, can you comment perhaps on the relevance of the issues that the Global Panel has covered in this policy brief, especially at the moment with the coronavirus outbreak, and also on the role that multi-sectoral responses can really play in strengthening food systems, particularly in these fragile contexts? So Mark, you have the floor.
Well, Sandy, thank you very much indeed. And I'm really pleased to be able to join the event today. Let me congratulate the panel to start with for the production of the policy brief, which I think is a valuable contribution to the state of knowledge on these issues around the world. But what I will try to do is complement what especially Uta and Patrick have said about the food system and the way it interacts with the humanitarian system. But then I want to say something as well about the implications of COVID-19 for this. COVID-19 is a dislocating event, and you know, it has huge implications for many things, but including the way we have to think about and deal with the issues around food security and food system resilience and so on. So I'd like to say a little bit about that as well. As Patrick said or alluded to, my first job actually was working on the response to famine in Ethiopia 35 years ago, and at that point the basic model for humanitarian response was essentially to provide food and a bit of water and a bit of healthcare, maybe some shelter, but basically in a siloized, not very joined up way. And what we've learned is that if you want to have an effective humanitarian response in any situation, you need a much better joined up response. In a way, you have to take, there's an analogy with what the panel has said about food, you have to take a system-wide response. And again, as Patrick alluded to, the humanitarian system has developed into an extremely effective system for the appeals that I coordinate, which is about 70% of the activity that Patrick's slides summarised. Last year we raised something like $18 billion. We reached more than 100 million people, and we certainly saved millions of lives, but we also kept lots of places a lot more stable and provided the opportunity to buy time to find solutions, which, in the absence of which, more problems would have spread, and the collateral contagion effects would have been much greater. So the humanitarian system is better than it used to be, and it also contributes to wider goods than its basic purpose, which is simply saving the lives of people caught up through no fault of their own in crises. Now, how does all this relate to the food system? Well, in most places where we operate, most working adults, many of them women, make a living and feed their families by growing food. And that is obviously interrupted and disrupted and undermined by humanitarian crises, mostly by conflict-related crises. And there's something like 1.8 billion people on the planet living now in fragile regions with high security risks, high economic risks, high environmental risks. And that is a population that's growing to reach 2.3 billion by 2030. And as the brief says, the underlying fragility of the food system has causes. So what are the causes? Well, they start with the list that Patrick alluded to: conflict, climate impacts, demographic change, which adds to pressure on resources, entrenched poverty, a failure of development in these places compared to other parts of the world over the last 50 years, and in particular, weak governance, which makes responses to these problems much less effective in these settings than they are in other places in the world which are affected by, for example, natural disasters. And one of the challenges we have in these settings is that these causes are generally concurrent. In other words, you get all of these problems all at once, rather than just one of the things that Patrick and I have talked about at a time to deal with, and that makes it much more entrenched, obviously, and difficult to deal with. What that's also meant is that food security problems have been growing in recent years. The annual update on global hunger and food insecurity that the Food and Agriculture Organization, WFP, produce has shown a reversal of a trend that we'd seen over much of the last 30 years, in the last 5 years or so, with the number of people on the planet getting hungry, increasing a little bit as opposed to falling fast, which is what we had been used to seeing. So the set of causes I've talked about have very clear and identifiable effects. What we've also got with COVID is some additional disruptions. The food security system in the places I've talked about are subject to disruptions in production, processing, trade and consumption in normal times, but those things have got worse as a result of measures governments have put in place in a desire to suppress the virus over recent months, and they have also been compounded by the effects of the global economic contraction. So there's been a substantial reduction in remittances, for example. Many of these countries are reliant on food sent home by their nationals to family members. Take somewhere like Yemen. Half of Yemeni families receiving remittances have lost half of that money since April. Likewise, their export earnings, which have tended to rely on primary products, have been affected by the fall, for example, in oil prices and in the effectively additional trade barriers that are put in place as a result of well-intentioned but nevertheless consequential measures to repress the virus. So the effect of all these things is that we are now projecting a much higher level of food insecurity at the starvation level as a result of the virus than we were projecting at the beginning of the year. At the beginning of the year, we forecast there'd be something like 135 million people around the planet who were at the acute levels of food insecurity, starvation level of food insecurity. That has now doubled to 270 million people, and that's an example of the extent to which the coronavirus crisis is a dislocating event. It substantially changes the set of problems that we're trying to deal with. Many of those people, who include a lot of displaced people, refugees and people displaced in their own countries, are not covered by national social protection health systems, and that makes them even more vulnerable to shocks. And these people are concentrated in the places you would expect if you'd read the policy brief: Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Haiti, Niger, Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, some parts of Syria. These are all places where millions of people could face starvation by the end of the year. It's clear that we need a multi-sectoral approach to strengthening food systems. I just want to re-emphasize that point, which both Patrick and Uta have made. And one of the reasons we need that is because some of the other drivers of the problem are visibly growing in impact. Above all, the impact of climate change. If you travel to lots of countries and talk to people, as I do, particularly if you do it, as Patrick alluded to, having done it over a period of decades, you meet lots of people who tell you a clear story of how they remember changes in their lifetime in the local climate. I was on the shores of Lake Malawi last year talking to older people who told me a very clear story about how they remember the climate used to be in their locality and how it is now. And you hear the same story from people wherever you go, really, subject to particularly people reliant on rain-fed agriculture. And that, of course, is corroborated increasingly by the science as well. So there are some long-term drivers for trying to find a better solution, particularly to the underlying problems. The humanitarian assistance is very effective in saving lives, but it doesn't provide the underlying solution. What we need to do for that is develop livelihoods in a more sustainable way, make more progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, and continue to pay attention to the range of nutrition issues, as has been alluded to already, not just calories, but nutrients as well, so that we have genuinely a system-wide approach. let me just finally say a few things about the scale of the dislocations the COVID crisis is putting in front of us to deal with. This is the biggest international crisis in 50 years. You can all see the effect on it, obviously, in the richer world. Countries in the richer world, the OECD and the G20, have had to throw out the rule book for the way they run their economies and their public services. They've thrown out the rule book for fiscal policy and multiple monetary policy in order to protect their citizens and their economies. Now, the impacts, in fact, on the most fragile countries and the most vulnerable people are, it's now clear, much greater, much more life-threatening than the impacts in richer countries. And they are not just about the impact from the virus. We don't really know how many lives the virus will take in fragile and conflict-affected countries, partly because there's very little testing, so we don't know the spread of it, and partly because health services are essentially unavailable in many places, which means that, among other things, that people with the virus see no advantage to trying to seek help because they know there won't be any help, and so they tend to not disclose that they think they may have the virus. What we can see very evidently, though, is huge impacts on the wider economy. That's where that doubling of food insecurity that I talked about earlier comes from. It's also the origin of what's essentially a large-scale collapse in basic health services across these countries at the moment. We see in 80 countries dramatic declines in immunization services. We see substantial declines in the availability of malaria prevention and control. We see a big drop in the number of people who have access to their HIV antiretrovirals. We see a big reduction in the effectiveness of water and sanitation programs to protect people against cholera. Now, in the past, when there's been a really large-scale crisis of this sort, there has been, to some degree, a reasonably effective international response. If you think about the 2008-9 financial crisis, which is probably the biggest thing we've seen before in the last few decades before COVID, although it's much, the effects are much smaller than COVID, as I've said. What you had then was a slow but ultimately quite effective international response, mobilised particularly by the US and the UK through the G20, which provided a lot of additional resources to the international system to protect the poorer countries. The balance sheets of the international financial institutions were rebuilt. There was a big allocation of special drawing rights, that shared global currency, which everybody got an allocation from. There was a significant increase in resource availability from the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And there was also an increase in humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian assistance levels in 2010 were about 40% higher than they were in 2008.
Just a couple more minutes, please, Mark. Thanks.
Yes. Now, the point I want to draw attention to is we have not had that response this time. We've had a grossly inadequate response, and that is actually not in the interests of the richer world, because if the poorer world doesn't get help to deal better with this challenge, the problems starting there will spread to other places. So out of self-interest, as well as out of empathy and generosity, it would be a good idea for the rich world to try to mobilize a much stronger response than we have got at the moment. And that includes support to the food system, as well as to the other issues that I've talked about. So thank you very much indeed. Looking forward to the discussion, and let me stop there for now.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark, for that very expansive account of what's happening and how it's all going to fit together in terms of food systems. I'm sure we'll get plenty of questions around that. We're now going to, actually, before I proceed, can I just remind all speakers to make sure that they have their microphones unmuted? We've had a bit of background noise. Now, the next part of our meeting, that's with the exception of our next speaker, who I'm going to introduce very shortly. So we're now going to hear people who are actually from people actually working directly in those fragile contexts about the priorities and interventions for food systems in their own regions. And we've got 3 people. We're firstly going to hear from Ms. Kumbra Sow, who's the FAO Sub-Regional Coordinator for Resilience, West Africa and the Sahel. And then we'll hear the perspective from the Sun Movement representative in Somalia. And finally, we're going to hear from Michael Dunford, who's the WFP representative in East Africa. So first of all, I'd like to turn to Kumbra, please. I can see you there. Can you tell us more about the priorities and opportunities that are linked to food systems in your region, which I gather encompasses 18 countries? So do tell us more. You have the floor.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's really an honor to take the floor today at this launch of this very important brief, and I'm going to give you some perspective from West Africa and the Sahel. The reading of the policy brief and listening just now to Sir Lowcock and Professor Webb before suggests clearly that as we speak, the world food system is, under threat, and we need to react rapidly to prevent a global emergency, food emergency. That was also said in the global report against food crisis that were mentioned as well. But this is even clearer in a region like the Sahel, where since decades we face too many complex and multidimensional crises. And that's why I would like to make my presentation in 2 parts. A first part about the context and give some example of what we do here. Those crises, were mentioned: conflicts, climate change, droughts or floods, natural disasters, degraded land, loss of biodiversity. All these have been stressing the food systems and food security of millions of people in the Sahel, depending on agriculture and pastoralism. Very important one, because 25 million Sahelians depend on pastoralism for their livelihoods. 2020 is certainly a year of culmination as we are facing COVID-19, but also, with the support of OCHA, DFID and other partners, we are preparing for a possible invasion of desert locusts that would come from Eastern Africa, where they are already causing serious damages. The Sahel, and in particular the Central Sahel, faces severe food insecurity, if not famine, in 2020. This we will have to look at very carefully. And I would like to go back to what Patrick mentioned. It was not bad until 2014 in this region. West Africa was the only region in the continent that reached the target MDG 1C of having the proportion of undernourished people from 1990. And that was thanks to strong agriculture development programs at regional and national level, focusing on building value chains and reducing bottlenecks in local food systems. But as it was also said, SOFI 2020 states that the number of undernourished people in West Africa has passed from 37 million people in 2010 to almost 60 in 2019. And this number would double according to projections, reaching close to 119 million by 2030. What does it mean for West Africa and for Africa in general is that the achievement of the Malabo Declaration and the SDG 2 are fading away. And of all the regions in the world, the affordability of a healthy diet poses the greatest challenge in Africa. And in this continent, just to give an example, the average cost of a healthy diet exceeds the average food expenditure, according to SOFI. And this is 2.2 times higher in our region in West Africa than anywhere else. Those progress that we mentioned before, that's why actually we did not see any famine occurring in this region while we were very familiar with famine. We must make sure that those progress we made in the past are not vain. And this implies indeed building long-term resilience and food systems that are at risk. It includes making sure the production cycle and access to healthy and nutritious food is not interrupted under any circumstances. And an example is that's why actually when there are shocks such as conflicts or natural disaster that leads, for instance, to massive displacements, it is important to support those internally displaced people that Sir Lowcock was mentioning, to not depend only on food aid, but to receive cash and inputs to produce when possible on their own, to feed their families with nutritious food and eventually have surplus they can sell to local markets. We have seen this working. We have examples in, for instance, there is a program jointly implemented by FAO and WFP in Northeast Nigeria. Now, this summer, during this very lean season, the Cadre Harmonisé, that is the food security analysis tool that also informed the global report against food crisis, foresees 17 million people in a food security crisis and close to 50 million people with the COVID-19. And more than 15 million, this I just read last week, 15 million cases of acute malnutrition expected in 2020, according to UNICEF and WFP in a recent publication. That was just last week. So COVID-19 has, only exacerbated the dysfunctioning of food systems in already very fragile context with the negative effects of health measures. In this region, we did not have that much cases, let's say, of COVID-19. So Lowcock also mentioned it, but it's more the measures that created that many problems. Restrictions, closure of border, that made it difficult even to assess the situation and deliver assistance. Curfews, lockdown in many countries, Burkina, Chad, Niger, Senegal, Togo, name them. And it also made difficult urban food trade. We saw great impact on food supply and demand, great loss of incomes and employment, loss of production with reduced access to inputs, and higher food prices, up to 10% in Mali and 30% in Nigeria. I'd like to remember here that at least 2/3 of food needs in the region are met by markets. So we have been repeating it, but COVID-19 could not come at a worse time for vulnerable population in West Africa and the Sahel. Within FAO's comprehensive COVID-19 response and recovery program, innovation and digitalization are key in this context to preserve food system. And I just want to go to some very concrete action. Some governments implemented food distribution, for instance, but consisted of staple food,
time now, just wind up,
oil, yes, imported powdered milk, rather than purchasing locally from producers. So an example of initiative is the household food basket that I want to mention before finishing. Working with other UN agencies, FAO is trying to strengthen that bridge during the pandemic between farmers that have no access to market to sell their fruits and vulnerable population who don't have enough resources to afford fresh and nutritious food. And we're targeting specifically family headed by women and with children under the age of 5. I will stop here. I had much more to say, but I would like, just before concluding, we need to address a few things. And I think the World Food Summit that is about to start to happen, a food system summit, will help us. And this event, alongside with other events that the Global Panel is organizing, contributes to helping stakeholders to better understand and manage the complex choices that we have to make for food systems. It also creates platform for engagement. I think it's extremely important that this summit comes up with national, regional perspective, and I thank the Global Panel for this opportunity.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Kumba, for joining us. That was really, really valuable to have you giving us that on the ground perspective. Now, next we're going to hear from Dr. Mohamed Abdi Farah, who is the Sun Focal Point in Somalia. And Dr. Farah, can you hear me? I think Dr. Farah is with us.
Yes, I can hear you very well, please.
Excellent. Okay, we're a little bit slow on time today, so if you could, in about 5 minutes, we'd really like to hear about what the situation is like in Somalia, and if you could kindly tell us what are the main challenges, perhaps with a few examples of interventions that are being implemented to strengthen food systems in your country. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks for the global panel inviting me to be part in this very important occasion. And I thank everybody who really participated in the organization of this event. And although I have very little time, 5 minutes too small for me, but however, the situation in Somalia needs no explanation. Everybody knows that we are in real and fragile context where people are really very much displaced, and millions of them depend on humanitarian assistance. And majority of the population, if not 80%, really are in some sort of stress or emergency as far as food and availability and security is concerned. Malnutrition is to the higher side, and combined with the droughts we had, the floods, and the virus, plus the locusts now, we are experiencing a really very tough time in that way that 5.2 million people in Somalia now are in need of humanitarian assistance, and around 1 million children is expected to go into malnutrition within the coming months. And the remittance from outside, which is a support to the livelihood, have really gone down from 30 to 50%. The livestock and exploitation had fallen from 25 to 35%, and 20% of the urban population living in IDPs really cannot afford energy-only food. And having said that, this background gives us a real context of fragile, combined with weak governance and conflicts and all sorts of problems. However, the Somali people really have 5 livelihoods, which are pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, riverine, IDPs, and urban, and majority of they depend on the stable food, which is 80% exported from outside. So the local production is very, very little. What we have done is in the past year and this year, we have been trying to understand the situation in which way that we can convert the approach of only humanitarian response in that situation, combine it with a kind of developmental things. So humanitarian development nexus has been an issue being discussed, mainly on the food systems and food insecurity. And one of the things we have done was the field nutrient gap analysis report, which has been concluded with the support of WFP, and also a cost of diet analysis report throughout the country. And that one really revealed that meeting nutritious diet for an average household of Somalia costs 4 times more the only energy diets, which makes it very, very expensive. That the average was $6.996, around $7 to meet the nutrient need, the nutritious food. We've been trying to change the basket, which is only energy diet, into a bit of nutritious diet, and at the same time assessing the market availability, accessibility, and the food and food production, and using the locally produced foods, trying to come up with combination of foods that can provide nutritious diet to the population. And that resulted in developing several strategies and policies, which included the food fortification strategy that guides the trade aspect of food, and also increasing the awareness of small scale and industries and households to be able to produce a kind of food into their own systems without supporting them from outside with prepared food putting on the plate. In fact, I'm sorry to say, but from 1990, Somalia was in this situation, and humanitarian action have been going on. I don't know to blame maybe the environment, the conflict, the droughts, and all those things, but on top of that is also to look into the programming and how we were approaching to this humanitarian crisis, which really led into having the feeding center, which has been opened 1990 to still run up till now and treat offsprings of those who were there by that time with acute malnutrition. That gives us that the approach we were taking would have been more advantageous if we could have combined it with development thinking, and we could use the humanitarian funds to make a seed or a foundation to kick off the development. Thinking and rethinking is really very much needed. In this way, we have developed the Common Results Framework, which is the nutrition strategy, and for the 5 years, and also the government have developed the social protection policy and the strategy, and approached the donors in a way that we rethink the way we approach the humanitarian crisis that Somalia is running into. This time, the humanitarian and development and communications and approach is really improving. This year, we are planning to do a study on integration of nutrition sensitive and specific programming in the country so that we can link the two and understand how this reprogramming can happen through the multi-sectoral approach, which is run by the SAN Secretariat at the Office of the Prime Minister. Ministerial and a sectoral approach has also now changed into becoming together and reprogramming whatever we have been doing in the past. To conclude, I would say that we need to address the grassroots and the drivers of food insecurity and malnutrition. Then we could have struggled with the outcomes, which is the malnutrition rates, and trying to reduce it. That will never take us anywhere, and we'll continue always chasing the global targets. We shall never reach it if we don't have rethinking, if we don't have reprogramming, if we don't have multi-sectoral approach, and if we don't have governments leading the programs and the responses that we are making. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farrar, and we really hear those points that you made at the end about the need for rethinking. So we are rather late because we've had such rich conversations. This does mean that we can, I have got permission from the organisers to continue for 10 more minutes so that we can cram a few questions in, but as I said at the beginning, we will be answering questions during the week. So please do keep them coming in. We have a final contribution now from Michael Dunford, who's Regional Director, East Africa, WFP. And Michael, I can see you there. Can you tell us more about the food systems priorities in your region and what are the lessons you have learned? And again, if you can more or less squeeze that into 5 or 6 minutes, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Sandy, and thanks very much for the invitation. Greetings from Nairobi. In Eastern Africa, WFP is dealing with a range of fragile contexts, and the majority of our portfolio across the region responds to vulnerabilities induced by conflict and instability, leading to both internal and cross-border displacement. Our largest operations in the region include 3 of the countries, Ethiopia, Somalia, and South Sudan, that are included in the report, which are identified as absorbing over 50% of the humanitarian needs. So as you can see, in East Africa, this issue of fragility is one of the key considerations for everything that we are doing. The other key drivers of food insecurity include natural disaster, climate change, and seasonal hunger. On average, WFP is already trying to reach 21 million people with an expected spend of almost 2 billion. 80% of this is in emergency contexts, dealing with the people that we've been discussing. We've already heard from Samark about the implications of COVID and how this is only going to increase the demands, which of course is an enormous worry for all of us. Fundamentally, as indicated already by the other panelists, we're talking about the failure of existing food systems to meet the existing needs of the populations. And when we look into the future, we can see that these needs are going to continue to increase. One of the key considerations we consider is the political determination, the political willingness to address the needs. As I've indicated, fragility throughout the region very often is linked to political instability. the failure of these food systems is not simply because of the technical weaknesses of the system. In the absence of political determination, the population needs are always going to struggle to be met. We've also heard that, in many of the populations, the cost of affordable, nutritious diets is simply beyond them. What we really need to do is better understand what are the obstacles, what are the determinants, and how can we make smart investments in trying to provide not only purely the calories required, but also the micronutrients, which are so important for the development of the population, particularly the most vulnerable and particularly the young. We've heard about the instability and the impact of price fluctuations, and Somalia is a good point in case, where the ability of the population to absorb any type of price shock is simply not there. And so we need to work to see how we can stabilize markets, strengthen markets, so that the population will be able to afford what is required. I know I'm a bit pressed for time, so I'll keep moving. But one of the key issues from a WFP perspective, which we struggle with, is our dual mandate. We're both humanitarian and also development. And Sir John mentioned earlier that he was pleased to see WFP expanding beyond the humanitarian. This is an area that we would love, in collaboration with our Rome-based agencies and others, to see further investments. But unfortunately, because the humanitarian needs are so great, much of our funding in our context, 80%, is absorbed in this regard. So there is a challenge. We talk about the nexus. I think it requires all of us to go beyond just the dialogue and really see how we can start to bridge the humanitarian development and increasingly the peace nexus to ensure adequate funding for the populations that we support. That said, with all of these challenges, there are some successes. And in the report, there are also a number of WFP interventions that are highlighted, including work around post-harvest loss mitigation, including using new technologies such as use of cold storage in Somalia. We're looking in Kenya under a program called Bamba Chakula, which is looking to see how we can link supply chains with the traders and the producers, and then supporting the refugee population, of which there are hundreds of thousands in Kenya. In Burundi, we're looking to see how we can work with the private sector, with FAO, to ensure that school children are able to access fresh milk as part of their school meals. And of course, in Ethiopia, where WFP has substantial experience, we're looking to introduce fresh food vouchers. So there's a range of different interventions. WFP this time is providing up to 25% of all support through cash and vouchers. So there's been a fundamental shift in the way that we've worked. People were reminiscing about what happened in Ethiopia 35 years ago, when primarily it was all in-kind food. Now, a significant proportion of our operation is through cash-based transfers. And this gives an ability to empower beneficiaries to make decisions for themselves, but also this money is now working its way through the economy, strengthening the food systems and the value chains that are required. So the last one, and in fact Dr. Abdi mentioned it, was the work that WFP and others have been doing around fill the nutrient gap. Here is an opportunity to really stop and analyze closely what are the impediments to affordable diets, and where can we make interventions to unblock such impediments. It gives us a much greater understanding to contextualize specific to the country or the region that we are operating, as opposed to adopting a one-size-fits-all approach, which we know is never going to be as effective.
just running out of time now.
In which case, let me finish up just to say that we, along with many others on this call, stand ready to support and strengthen the systems, linking also beyond food systems to educational, health and other social protection systems to enhance the capacity and the ability to respond to the people that we serve to support. So thanks very much, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks very much, Michael. Well, I think we've had some really inspiring talks today. I think we've heard a great deal from not just from people working for international organizations, but it's been great to have colleagues from East Africa, Somalia, and so on. So I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to put. I do understand, as we're scheduled to finish at 3:15, that if anyone needs to leave, of course they should. But for anyone who can stay for another 10 minutes so we can do justice to a few of the questions, that would be great. And as I say, we will be endeavouring to answer some of these questions during the week. So I've got two questions here, and I'm going to allocate them so that there's one for Patrick, which we'll go to first, but I'm going to read out the other one as well. So the question for Patrick from a person who's anonymized is rather a good one, actually. In a globalized world, how can we ensure that the strengthening of food systems in fragile contexts won't result over the long term in growing rates of obesity and overweight? So Patrick, I'll come back to you in a second. And there's another question which I'd like to put to Sir Mark and also briefly to Dr. Farrar about involving the private sector, particularly with the multi-sector approach to building resilience. How can you really involve the private sector more? So going to Patrick first on this risk, this long-term risk of actually pushing people perhaps in the wrong direction. How can we ensure that we don't do that?
We can't. Okay.
Right.
That's a simple answer. What we have to do is keep a single-minded focus on the quality of diets, the quality, safety, and local value of diets. So a good quality diet matters to prevent undernutrition and micronutrient deficiencies, but a good quality diet is also an essential element of preventing non-communicable diseases that are diet related, like heart disease, stroke, many cancers, and related overweight and obesity. So it's not a single thing. We have to improve and strengthen the food systems as overall to deliver sustainably produced healthy diets for all. And that, of course, has to then be linked to making them affordable, but also empowering those who purchase food to make better informed decisions. So education, information, and improved retail systems and so on, right? So it's not a simple answer, of course, but at the core is a strengthened, resilient food system that delivers healthy, sustainable diets.
Sandy, you unmute.
Sorry, I was on mute there. So can we just move to the question to Sir Mark and then after to Dr. Farrar about involving the private sector in building this multi-sectoral approach? Would you like to comment on that, Mark?
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you for the question. Of course, the private sector as a share of the economy is much bigger in the countries we're talking about than it is in rich countries. Virtually the whole of the agricultural sector is in private hands, either small-scale producers or some larger businesses as well. So, you know, probably the most important thing to do still in these contexts is to try to make markets work better, to try to have less interference from the state in the natural operation of markets, and to try to create better incentives for suppliers to put in the hands of producers the right technologies and capabilities to enable the sector to work better. So that you know, a lot of that is not very glamorous, set of issues around public policy and how public policy works, but that it's still in lots of the context where we're working is where the returns are highest. So doubling down on all that is probably the most important thing to do in most settings.
Okay. Okay, Dr. Farah, would you like to comment? Are you still with us? Can we hear you on mute? Can you unmute?
Yes.
Thank
now
you.
I did, sorry.
That's okay.
In fact, that's a very valid question because one of the biggest challenge we have is limited involvement of the private sector to the food system. That is really a big challenge. However, if we look at the interventions that we have prioritized, majority of it has to do with the private sector, like increasing household purchasing power. We are thinking of food and cash transfer and ability to that, and that really has to be done through the private sector because the government does not reach all corners of the country, and we are using private sector to transport that cash to the people. And if you look at increasing availability of food, we were thinking of market-based interventions, which is led by small scale industries and also smallholders in production of locally available foods which has been fortified or diversified so that they can be accessible and cheaper. And if you look at other interventions that we have been prioritized, and majority of them, supplementation and school feeding programs, and if you look at and post-harvest reductions, minimum wage, all of these really involve private sector, and that the involvement is really very, very difficult. The engagement is very much unregulated, and the approach to them is not easy. However, the government is very much trying to put the private sector in place, and that's what the food fortification strategy has really had so many job tasks on, increasing the involvement of small scale and large scale industries, both in fortification, in diversification, in production of quality foods, in production of nutritious foods, and their involvement is really very important, and we're trying our best to reach to them as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farah. We have a third question here, but I'm going to make it one of those that we respond to, and we'll put it on our website. But it's a good question about what the 3 Rome-based agencies are doing to set up a collaboration mechanism to work together in this critical period between emergency assistance and the longer term investment in food systems. So I think that is something we would really like to hear more about, but we're out of time now. So that's something that I'm going to share with my colleagues here, and you can look online for the response to that. So we'll do the same with some of the other questions that we haven't been able to answer. We're very pleased. We've had over 600 people online who've stayed the course with us, and apologies again for the slight overrun. So I just want to close now. I'm going to first of all express my thanks to all of the speakers. We've been very pleased to have such a diverse collection of people, and thank you for joining us, what is for sometimes quite a short time, but we're very pleased. Thanks again to WFP for making this event possible and hosting this, and particularly thanks to the WFP technical team who did an outstanding job, I think, in pulling us all together, and of course Global Panel members, Secretariat, and all the peer reviewers who helped us with the brief. Very many thanks to all those people, and we look forward to future events. I'd finally like to thank the audience. Thank you for joining us today. Please look online for answers to the questions. And on that note, I'm going to say that the meeting is now closing, and goodbye, and thank you very much.